First is Greg Mancini on behalf of Build Rhode Island.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I am a lobbyist for Build Rhode Island. I am also representing the trades in front of the EFSB. So I am familiar with this process, although, you know, our input is limited to one of the factors. There's 4 factors that the committee considers, and we are limited to talking about one of those 4 factors. I have also been here at least one time and heard some previous testimony, in particular testimony from Mike McElroy, and certainly have great respect for Mike. He's doing an able job, a good job advocating for his client, town of Burrillville, in front of the EFSB. And the testimony I heard with Mike, he talked about one of the issues, one issue I want to talk about, and then I'll talk about some overall other suggestions. But one of the things that Mike had talked about was the fact that he had all of these resolutions from cities and towns, and they were discounted by the EFSB, substantially discounted by the EFSB, and they weren't taken as evidence, but they were taken as public comment. Mike, I talked for a while about this and thought that that was an error on the board's part, or at least going forward, they should be given more weight to the cities and towns' comments. And I would, as I said, I get respect for Mike, but I would respectfully disagree with that. I think that the whole purpose of this legislation or this act is to, create a statewide policy. And I think that certainly you want to have local input from the community that's affected, but I think when you get into other communities chiming in and who just really have only had the advocates go before them and advocate for certain resolutions, they don't have all the facts. They don't go through a hearing process, and they're just going along with the advocacy of a particular group. And I think in each of those instances, none of them included the fact that, or thought about the fact that, well, the cost of energy to their town could go up if this plan is not built. And I don't think anyone even assessed that fact. Now, it may not, but our position would be that it would go up if a needed power plant's not built. That's just one issue. I'd also make a comment is before you start altering legislation post-Burrillville Power Plant, I'd like you to think about the fact that in 5 to 10 years, the state or the city or the town of Johnston's going to have to site a new landfill. And anything you do, I would think, would have an impact on that. Because if I was a citizen of the town of Johnston and I saw legislation passed by this body that gives disproportionate local impact or local say to any type of power plant or anything else, I'd be up here advocating for a Me Too bill for landfills. So I think that is a really important factor that you have to realize, that the implications of this body could have to other statewide needs. And,
well, how are landfills cited now?
Landfills are cited, I believe, through legislation enacted by the General Assembly that created the resource recovery. Mike Sabatoni may know better than me, but let me just say this much. It's the same thing with the airport, same thing with the ACI. There's all these things that have to go in cities and towns, and they're all cited initially by enabling legislation by the state of Rhode Island. And I'm sure there's a permitting process the landfill will have to go through, don't get me wrong, but I think that my recollection of the last time the landfill expanded, there was vehement opposition from the residents of the town of Johnston. Notwithstanding that, they were allowed to expand. So, and that was just me as a citizen. Actually, I wasn't even a lawyer at that time, but that was my recollection. So I would just be very careful what you do in terms of altering legislation. But I don't know if I answered your question, but that's...
You did, but my larger point was, with regard to energy facility siting, we have a specific statute that exists. And so we're looking at changing that specific statute. And I understand your point of whenever you have a project that's controversial, doing something here may have ripple effects with other potentially controversial projects. But my point is, unless they have equivalence to this statutory scheme, your analogy breaks down, because we're looking at something that exists today, that people are dealing with today, and not everybody's thrilled with the way it's working. We look around at other states and we see that perhaps they're doing some things maybe worse than us, maybe better than us. That's the purpose of this. But your analogy to other controversial projects, I understand it, but my point is, here we're dealing with a specific statutory scheme, so I think it makes sense for the legislature to look at that now 30-year-old scheme and say, does it still work the way we intended it? Can we improve it?
I certainly think you can always improve legislation, and I certainly know where you're coming from, and I have a couple suggestions for improving it, and that's why I'm here. Okay.
I did interrupt you, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I didn't mean to interrupt you. So
no, that's
please
fine. I'm glad you did, because you raised a legitimate point. All I'm saying to you is, regardless of how you alter it, if you have a scheme that has too much local influence, you're going to have the town of Johnson residents come up here and say, we want more influence over studying the expansion of landfill. You're going to have the city of Warwick residents coming up here saying, we want more influence over any potential airport expansion. You're going to have the city of Cranston residents coming up here and saying the same thing about the ACI. So I would just be very careful about what type of local input, because the siting of energy facilities is important to the economic development and to the quality of life and to the environment of the whole state of Rhode Island, not just one particular town. And the same as what we all use Green Airport as that's the airport we all use, and the same thing with the landfill. So that's only my point, and I think, in terms of this act, one thing I will tell you, one suggestion I do have is, I think you could better refine the factors that are considered. I found them somewhat vague, if you wanted the truth. Give me an example. They have to, one of the factors is, and the fact that we're involved in, is a socio-economic impact of the facility. Now, there is a little bit of history of that through prior administrative decisions, but if you take a look at that and the other factors, I think it could be tightened up quite a bit. I would also suggest to you that you really got to take a look at a cost-benefit analysis, no matter what the factor is, because you're going to be able to figure out a way to quantify a cost-benefit analysis, whether it's the environment, whether it's socioeconomic, whether the project is needed. And I don't have language to suggest to you today, but I think that'll help. I think that'll help the citizens of Rhode Island if we say, after a cost-benefit analysis, this is in the best interests of our state, or this is not in the best interests of our state. So those are my primary suggestions for you. I did bring a copy of the testimony we submitted, because I think what has been, and I'd like it to be included in the record, because I think to me, it's all about cost-benefit. I mean, even with the environment, certainly I consider myself pro-environment, but at what cost is carbon pricing, for example, or what cost is, renewables. Renewables right now are not affordable. In some years, hopefully they will be. I'm sure you know that we had supported and we had advocated for the wind turbine project off Block Island. So, but that was at the time a much higher kilowatt price than what you can deliver regular either gas or coal. Well, not coal, but gas for. So I think you're going to have some sort of cost-benefit analysis. To that end, I do have, I would like to submit in the record our testimony. It does have a study in there from we have 2 economists that we hired that'll be testifying before the board when the hearings get going. Other than that, Mr. Chairman, you know, I would say one thing, that I certainly favor strong abutter rights. You know, I understand that, but I would be very careful with strong local rights, meaning town rights, for the reasons I had elicited to you, because there's only one power plant or two power plants, there's only one airport, it's going to affect the entire state. And that's a tricky balance that you have to deal with. And it's not easy, I know that, and I certainly understand the passion that the residents of Burrillville are going through and how they feel about it. But I also say, I think there was also a lot of outside influence from people outside the town who had their own agenda, who I think tried to manipulate the process. And I'm not saying you do anything about that, but I do think that that has played into the chain of events in this particular, with this particular sighting or potential sighting. I mean, we're getting hissed at sighting board meetings and stuff like that, and I think it's over the top. So.
Well, I, as you know, I have attended all of those siting board meetings, and I think that goes both ways. And I will tell you that in my 41 years, most of them lived in Burrillville, and even those not lived in Burrillville, still very connected to the town. I have never seen the community respond to anything the way that the people of Burrillville have responded to this proposal, and it was entirely organic, and it was entirely locally centered. So I would probably disagree with that, Mr. Mancini.
You would know better than I. That was my suspicion. Some pretty cruel things said, and that was just my suspicion. So.
Any questions for Mr. Mancini? Mr. Rosselli.
Thank you, and Mr. Mancini, thank you for coming today and giving testimony. One of the reasons I decided to accept being on the board on the study commission was to learn, was to have an opportunity to hear from a variety of people from a variety of different situations, both on the environmental side, the labor side, and every other side as well. One of the things I'm trying to wrap my head around is this idea that somehow a landfill and an airport being public entities is different than a private enterprise coming in wanting to build a private, for-profit company anywhere in Rhode Island, and how the distinction is made. And I've heard this argument before, that we may be giving too much local control, and then the examples that are used are the landfill and the airport. So the landfill and the airport, from what I understand, and let me go on for just 30 seconds if I can, Mr. Chairman, and then please respond. So how is the landfill and the airport, which are clearly a state benefit, both in terms of economic, perhaps environmental, how is that different? How are those different than a private enterprise coming into anywhere in the state and saying we want to put something here to make money from all of you? How is that different?
How is it different? How is it the same? To me, I think they're very similar. Very similar components. To me, that the issue is not how are they incorporated, whether it's a public incorporation or a private or quasi-public incorporation. To me, is the function and the value they provide to the economy and to the citizens of the state of Rhode Island. So energy facilities go through an extensive permitting process, as you know, and one of the factors that the EFSB considers is the need for energy for the citizens of the state and for the region. Sure. And it's the same situation, I believe, with the airport. Their expansions are determined by what's the economic need for the citizens of the state of Rhode Island. So, you're only going to have one or two power plants, and you're only going to have a couple airports, and for that matter, they're both because there's so few of them and they serve so many, I think they're very similar. And same with the landfill, too. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. Well, it was an answer, so thank you for that answer. I want to explore, and if I can have another minute or so.
Would you have a question for Mr. Mancini?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, then by
Yeah.
all means.
So the question is, what is, and I'm just going to say this the way it's going to come out. Is there anything wrong with having too much not local control, but local input? And I hearken back to a number of situations that I've been in, and the offshore wind off of Block Island is a good case in point, and you brought that up. Good case in point. They spent almost 5 years of discussing it, a lot of public input, a lot of stakeholder investment went into that project before anything went into the ocean. So why not have that type of input in order to get something like a power plant or a landfill or an airport or anything else you mentioned built in this state?
So local control is always important, and I think there should be local control. It's a matter of balance. And you've got to balance the local input versus the needs of the greater good in the state of Rhode Island. Let me give you an example. Are you familiar with the FERC board?
Yep,
Okay.
sure, very
The
well.
FERC board just approved despite overwhelming opposition in front of the CRMC and the DEM, they just are going to approve a liquefaction expansion for an LNG project. The reason why they did that is because of the greater good for the region. And the local input was 99% negative. All right? Local people don't want it. And I understand that. And there's a good reason for that. But FERC has federal jurisdiction, and they think of the broader needs of the bigger community. And so as a consequence, they determined that this project is needed based on the evidence before them. But I got to say this much, that these administrative bodies are usually, and in this case, the adjudicators are experts in their field. There's due process for both parties, and it's not a rubber stamp. And so they have to balance what's in the best interests of a greater good than local input. And again, local input's great. It's just in legislation, in public comment, and through the administrative process, there's a balancing act that people have got to take.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Michael Sabatoni.
Mr. Mancini, weren't you not trying to make the analogy of not so much the structure of whatever entity is looking to cite whatever service they're providing, but actually making the analogy that the process of citing these entities and these endeavors are difficult, and the fact that there is local inconvenience, unfortunately, to whatever it is, whether it be a landfill, whether it be a railroad, whether it be a pipeline, an airport, a landfill, a power plant, profit, non-profit, that the procedure, all for making it better, if there is too much local influence, that the local community overwhelmingly in your dealing with this for the past 20 years in the construction industry is always negative. So overweighing that local influence would have a negative impact, whatever the citing agency is or the quasi-agency is. Is that not the analogy you were trying to make in your testimony?
Yes, and I can tell you that no matter what the project is nowadays, there's always local opposition. I don't care what it is. I don't care if you build a doghouse.
So it doesn't matter if it's for-profit or non-profit. Doesn't matter.
Correct. In fact, there's a tower that was just built, or not built, just approved by the 195 Commission. It was local opposition to that. No matter what it is, there's always like, so.
Just wanted to clear that up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, and so that I can continue to understand the analogy, are you suggesting that we as the legislature and this committee should be concerned with treating projects that are likely to bring forth local opposition in a like manner? And I have a follow-up question.
I would say generally yes, but I think my testimony would be that At the end of the day, these facilities, whether it's a landfill, a power plant, whatever it is, that only serve, that, you know, there's only one or two of them that serve the citizens of the state, that really is going to be the overriding factor, no matter what it is, no matter where it is. Now, there could be, you know, inappropriate places for some of these facilities. I get that, you know. But at the end of the day, that, you know, if you have zoning requirements and you have regulatory written regulatory requirements in place at the time, if someone applies for a permit to site a facility or building in a particular place, you know, I think at the end of the day, they should be granted it if it's in the overwhelming best interest of the citizens as a whole, the state of Rhode Island, and I think that is a General Assembly's determination, what is, and that's why you have your enabling legislation.
Well, we've talked about power plants and landfills, but what about casinos? Casinos require both a statewide affirmative vote and a local affirmative vote.
Yeah.
Why should casinos require a local affirmative vote and not power plants?
I'm with you on that. I don't have a problem with that analogy in the sense that the only reason why it happened is because the citizens of the state voted to allow that to alter their constitution, our constitution.
Yeah, it is constitutional.
So, I mean, I think that was, honestly, I think that was more political than anything else. I would also suggest to you, though, that a casino was a luxury, all right? I mean, I think, you know, I would say an airport, a landfill, and a power plant is a need. So that is just my opinion, so.
Any other questions for Mr. Mancini? Mr. Daniels.
Mr. Mancini, you'd mentioned that when you're talking about local control and overriding local control, you'd mentioned your concern about having a regulatory process in place and a zoning process in place and then upending that, so not following the rules. My question is that what happens if a community has decided what its industrial land is and they've set aside that area and a proposal is for something outside that area? So it's not necessarily the community itself, it's just how they've made their land use decisions. To what extent should the state or the siting board or the public good outweigh those local land use decisions? Because in some cases, it's not necessarily that they oppose a particular facility, it's just that it's not consistent with what their development plan is.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. My response to that is, I don't, generally speaking, I don't think you want to get into a situation where enabling legislation is overriding local zoning laws because they're in place. I think maybe you inadvertently misconstrued my comments relative to zoning and planning. What I was trying to say is, in that comment was that you can't, after the fact, change the rules on somebody once they. So that was my only reason for referencing zoning and land use laws. I didn't think you would be getting to that. Usually, most enabling legislation for things like this says you have to comply with local zoning laws or regulations and ordinances. So I don't think that's going to be a problem for you at all. So my only concern is in the balance of local comment and statewide needs, that the local comment, while important, doesn't override the needs of the greater goods of the citizens of the state of Rhode Island. Now, with the one caveat that I do think abutters should have strong rights.
Just to clarify, I did understand what you were saying. I think the point you were making is that a community makes its land use decisions and you shouldn't be able to change them after the fact to keep a facility out.
Correct,
I
that's right,
understand.
that's right.
But I was thinking more the converse, when you actually have an industrial zone and the proposal is to put it outside that zone. Is that fair? That was more the question, because I understood your concern about not wanting to flip, you know.
I would say that generally, no, that's not fair. But again, I think the most enabling legislation, you know, says if you're going to permit a power plant or a landfill, it's going to go into, I would say, with the one caveat of extraordinary circumstances. If we can't put a landfill anywhere, and we need to put it someplace, and it's zoned residential, or potentially residential, you know, and it makes sense economically for the citizens of the state of Rhode Island, then I think we could take a hard look at it.
Right. Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Greg.